This is Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Lectures on the Nature of Existence. I'm Sarah B., and today I'm going to share with you a 3-part lecture I recently presented for free on Zoom as a way to spread the word about my process groups and as a way to please my own self because I enjoy giving lectures. So I'm just going to read to you what I read to the lovely people who attended those lectures. Unfortunately, of course, you won't be privy to any of the wonderful discussions that we had, but maybe you can email me or start a discussion with friends around some of these ideas. Thanks so much for listening. Creating the Self, on the important role that pain and discomfort play in learning, and why shooting all over yourself isn't always a bad thing. As a student at the Center for Group Studies, I read lots of articles about running therapy groups and about psychoanalysis in general. The most recent of these was a Lucy Holmes 2006 article titled "Becoming an Analyst: Learning to Live with Madness, Aggression, and the Unknown." In it, Holmes writes that the mind itself is born out of anger and aggression. It is not pleasure and love, but frustration that develops ego. She also says that, quote, "Learning is unpleasure, an anxiety-ridden confrontation with the new and unfamiliar, and that helped me to understand that the creation of the self occurs in an atmosphere of frustration and discomfort that is very irritating." Those 2 quotes are what inspired this lecture. The phrase, "the mind itself is born," caught my attention first. Just that alone is a cool concept, and it got exponentially cooler when followed by the phrase, "out of anger and aggression." In the second quote, she uses the phrase, "creation of self," which I also loved, and which I borrowed for the title of this lecture, "Creating the Self." In reflecting on this phrase in light of the first one about the mind being born, it occurred to me that they're expressing the same thing. When the mind is born, the self is created. Although I know some Buddhists who might beg to differ. Of course, this is an ongoing process. The mind isn't just born once, but constantly in the process of being born, just as the self is constantly in a process of being created. Everything we experience contributes to this process. Or to be more specific, everything we learn contributes to it. And I don't mean learning like the kind we so often do in school. I don't mean the retention of facts that will enable us to pass a test. I mean the kind of learning that impacts our lives on a daily basis and influences how we show up in the world and how we navigate relationships. The kind of learning that involves trial and error, risk-taking, failure, and therefore pain. When Holmes describes learning as, quote, "unpleasure," as an anxiety-ridden confrontation with the new and unfamiliar, I was nodding in firm agreement, recalling my very early days as a therapist, which is when I had the realization, while driving down New Leicester Highway, passing the CVS on my left, that learning is synonymous with pain. If we are really and truly learning how to do something new, we will experience pain, or at the very least, discomfort. To repeat Holmes again, the creation of the self occurs in an atmosphere of frustration and discomfort that is very irritating. I'm in the process of starting a process group for people with chronic health conditions, and my interest in that area inspired me to read a book by Sophie Strand called "The Body is a Doorway: A Journey Beyond Healing, Hope, and the Human." In a chapter called "The Scream," she echoes Holmes in quoting the sociologist John Holloway, who said, "The starting point of theoretical reflection is opposition, negativity, struggle. It is from rage that thought is born. Not from the pose of reason, not from the reasoned sitting back and reflecting on the mysteries of existence that is the conventional image of the thinker. We start from negation, from dissonance. The dissonance can take many shapes: an inarticulate mumble of discontent, tears of frustration, a scream of rage, a confident roar, an unease, a confusion, a longing, a critical vibration. I received my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Goddard College, which sadly no longer exists, in the summer of 2015. And in January of 2016, I started a counseling externship at the Asheville Center for Contemplative Psychotherapy, which also no longer exists. The first client I met with in the low-fee basement clinic was doing trial sessions with all 4 externs to see whom she liked best. I did not get picked. The second client I met with also chose not to meet with me for a second time. Luckily, the third one was the charm, but that inauspicious beginning to my career did damage to my tender ego, and I struggled with painful insecurity for years, feeling inadequate and stupid on a regular basis. With practice, though, and good supervision, I got better at the job and did well enough with some of my clients to keep them coming back every week or two for several years, and I still work with some of them today. But as I approached my 8th anniversary of being a therapist, I continued to feel deep down what I'd felt in the beginning. This isn't what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. I did not hate my job by any stretch. It was the best job I'd ever had. But I didn't love it. It wasn't my calling. Whatever I was meant to do with my life, it seemed like I should be better at it by now than I was at being a therapist, and that I should enjoy it more. Over the course of the following year, I completed a well-renowned copy editing certificate program and built a website, hoping to make it as a freelance literary editor. I do have a BA in English from Appalachian State and an MFA in creative writing from NC State. I even drove 7 hours to attend an editing conference in Alexandria, Virginia. I bought a Chicago Manual of Style sweatshirt and coined the motto, "Sentences over psyches." I was ready to walk away from the therapy field. Then I discovered group. Pretty much on the day that I received my certificate of completion from the copy editing certificate program I'd spent $3,000 on, I realized with great clarity that I in fact did not want to be a professional editor, but a process group leader. I'd been a member of a group for about a year and 3 months at that point, and for most of that time had watched the leader and my longtime supervisor, Pamela Millis, in awe, thinking I could never possibly run a group. But then, for whatever reason, I got the idea that I could, and that could quickly turned into a should and a would, and almost overnight, running a process group of my own was all I could think about. To use a word that gets used way too much in our culture, I was obsessed. And if you haven't listened to this podcast before, I'll pause here just to say what a process group is. I've done various episodes on this topic and highly recommend listening to the one on the Louis Ormont book, The Group Therapy Experience. But in a nutshell, a process group is a group of strangers, usually 5 to 8 people, at least for me. Some like bigger groups. Sometimes groups can have as many as 20 people, but I like to cap mine at 8. And so it's a group of strangers who agree to meet every week and agree to do their best to put thoughts and feelings into words as they're happening, preferably toward other group members. So there's a big focus on the here and now and on all feelings and emotions being welcome, and an emphasis on talking instead of going into action. And going into action can look like many things. It can look like touching someone in a loving way or not so loving way. It can look like taking a sip of water instead of talking. It can look like stretching. It can even look like asking a question. because what's actually guiding the question is far more important in many cases than the question itself. So somebody's usually having a feeling towards someone, or they're relating to that person's experience in some way. So in those cases, I encourage people to turn their questions into statements if they can, and to name the feeling behind the question. There's a lot more I could say about process groups, but that paints a little bit of a picture for you. So that was in December of 2023 when I decided I was going to start running process groups. And I spent the next several months reading books by Louis Ormont, Irvin Yalom, and Rutan Stone and Shou. I watched the group series on YouTube 3 times, taking notes, and in May I attended my first weekend intensive training through the Center for Group Studies. In June, I started recruiting people for my first group, and on July 26th, we had our first session. A mixed-gendered group of 6 precious souls, which became 8 a couple months later, ranging from age 24 to 72. Driving to my office for that first meeting, I was terrified. But I also knew that I was as ready as I would ever be without ever having done the thing in question. I knew that the only way to learn how to do it was to do it. Or as one of my favorite Zen teachers says, even though I don't know how to do it, I'm finding out how to do it. Actually, if you'll humor me for a tangential moment, I'd like to share some more of that teacher's wisdom with you right now, because it all applies to group and to learning in general. This teacher's name is Edward S.B. Brown, and I attend his Dharma talks on Zoom multiple times a week. Here's a list of sentences I've written down quoting him since October of last year, to choose a random date. You're studying how to be you. You don't have the skills to be masterful. What are you going to do? There's a difference between a space that is safe, wholesome, nourishing, and a space where nothing painful happens. It doesn't seem possible to create a space where nothing painful happens. We're studying the use of language. A whole reality comes into being with the use of words. You can't help being you. The secret teaching is, you are here. Zen is to feel your way through the dark. That's Edward quoting Suzuki Roshi. Anything we take hold of, everything comes with it. The point of Zen practice is not to have things come out the way you want, but to survive things not coming out the way you want. Allow for more moments to occur. We're aiming to have some freedom of language. You are here, as in you equals here. You are presence itself. This moment has never happened before. What's it like? Something/anything happens because nothing stopped it from happening. How will you organize yourself to be ready for anything? And lastly, whatever happened then is over now. It's time to do something else. That last one proved to be quite the challenge for me in those early days of running my first group. I'd come home from a session and my brain would be on fire with love and regret as it cycled through everything that had transpired, what people had said and not said, how I'd intervened or not, and all the different ways it could have gone, the infinite possibilities. In my early days as a therapist for individuals, my brain would do something similar after a day of multiple sessions, but it more often caused me to berate myself than my post-group perseverating did. With group, there was so much going on, so much to track and tend to and play with that I couldn't possibly expect myself to get it right all the time. And what did getting it right even mean? And with individual clients, I didn't find myself eager for the next session, desperate for it actually, because it would be another chance to do better. But that's how I felt about group. I just wanted another chance and another chance and another chance. Having to wait a whole week for the next session to roll around was torture. I feared people would drop out of the group before giving me an opportunity to show them I could do better. I also feared, to a pathological degree, that I would get sick and have to cancel the next session. And then I'd have to go 2 weeks without another opportunity to practice. This fear of getting sick was a real paranoia and a genuine source of suffering for me, which lasted for well over a year. Writing was a big help in getting me through the long week between sessions, both as a form of self-supervision and as a way of reliving the exquisite complexity of the last meeting, a way of loving my group members, holding them in mind, immortalizing them on the page. I took copious notes, each a play-by-play, complete with dialogue, descriptive asides, and explorations of my own internal experience based on what memory could provide. These notes are also replete with should-haves and wish I hads and other expressions of regret which have proven invaluable in my learning process. So that's where I ended part 1 of my lecture, and then I opened things up for discussion and I shared a list of should-haves from the notes I was just talking about, the notes from my very first few sessions of the first process group I ever ran. So they are chock full of should-haves and wish I hads, and it was really fun exploring those with people in attendance. I'm not going to do that here. It gets pretty into the weeds with group stuff, and I know not everybody's as into that as I am. I do want to just reflect that the Lucy Holmes article in question that inspired this lecture is basically in 3 parts, and the first part focuses on aggression and how important it is for therapists and of course everyone to really be in touch with their anger and aggression, to be aware of its presence and to know how to channel it effectively. The second part is about stupidity and not knowing, and essentially gives therapists permission to be stupid and not know everything and to get things wrong. Indeed, it even encourages us to do things wrong on purpose sometimes so that the client can respond with their own aggression in correcting us, and for other reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the third part of the article focuses on craziness, insanity, and also gives therapists permission to be crazy and emphasizes how important that is in order for us to be able to relate to our clients. So I'll talk about that in a little more detail as well. But in that first section that you just heard, I really didn't talk that much about being aggressive as a therapist. It was more about the aggression that is required when we're learning something, which I did not explicitly say. I spoke about the irritation and frustration that can come with learning and the pain, but it does take aggression, which I'll define a little later in this episode more specifically, but it takes aggression to continue sticking with something that is hard. So I just want to emphasize that, and also that it takes a lot of aggression to be a group therapist, in that we really have to interject and interrupt and slow people down, and we have to think fast, ironically, in order to slow people down. And we have to muster our aggression and courage to speak, to say something that the group might not like, to move toward the fire. I'll talk about that later too. So anyway, I just want to emphasize that role of aggression in learning and in running groups, and in just plain speaking and using our voice to make words come out. So now I'll move on to the second part of the lecture, which focuses on stupidity and not knowing. In her article, Creating the Self, Lucy Holmes writes, "There's nothing worse than an analyst that's too smart, unless it's a patient that's too smart." Here she's actually quoting one of her most beloved mentors, Phyllis Meadow, and says that Dr. Meadow also explained that extremely smart patients are hard to cure because they can explain everything, and extremely smart analysts are not very good at their work because they think they know everything. This reminds me of the Zen concept of beginner's mind. Suzuki Roshi famously said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, in the expert's there are few." Dr. Meadow went on to say, "Your job as an analyst is to try to understand, and you can't begin to understand until you are aware of how stupid you are." And this actually makes a lot of sense. If I go in with an attitude of knowing, whatever I see will be warped to fit what I know, which makes real understanding impossible. And the etymology of understand is interesting, both at face value, to stand under something, which is much different from standing over something. Understanding implies being below or beneath something, humbling ourselves to it. But the word's historical root is more nuanced. In Old English, the under didn't mean beneath, but among, between, or in the midst of. So to understand means to stand in the middle of things, which you yourself are a part of. You're just standing there looking around and absorbing it all. This etymological perspective applies beautifully to how Holmes describes the client's private inner world, the one we're trying to understand. She calls it a lonely and chaotic realm in which we are all lost, alone, ignorant. She says we must, quote, enter a pre-Oedipal world to think in hallucination and in the language of the body, not in an intellectual or logical way. We must give up the world of thought itself for a state of meditation where there is very little thought. I've been listening recently to the new Kurt Weill album, Philadelphia's Been Good to Me, and there's a song on it called Holiday OKV, in which Weill sings, I think he's singing about songwriting and the self-deprecation and negativity that can accompany it. He says, "If I could ever just leave myself alone, quit thinking, more string plucking." String plucking implies feeling your way through things, trying things out to see how they sound, if they resonate, if they bring the songing process closer to becoming itself. It's a great metaphor for what we can, nay, must, do as therapists. We must pluck a lot of strings in trying to understand someone, and many of those strings will be wrong. This music metaphor also reminds me of when I was taking piano lessons several years ago. Actually, it was probably about 10 years ago now, when I was also just starting out as a therapist. My teacher was a man named Danny, and what I remember most about him was that he would commend me every time I hit the wrong piano key. He would even cheer sometimes. And even with that loving encouragement of my mistakes, I still felt so incredibly vulnerable having him witness me fuck up that I wound up bursting into tears and didn't come back after our third session. Haven't touched a piano since. But back to this notion of not thinking. It's a big part of why I love groups so much, and at least in the kind of process groups I run, I try to emphasize feelings over thoughts. The moment people start analyzing each other, I can feel the life getting sucked out of the room, because life is in the feelings. And I say that as someone who loves thinking. I mean, I put lectures on for fun, and for free. But I love thinking because of what it makes me feel. Unless, of course, it makes me feel something shitty, like when I'm caught up in worried or remorseful thoughts. Analyzing and interpreting have a distancing effect and mostly serve to make the analyzer or interpreter feel more comfortable with themselves. Quoting her very influential mentor again, Holmes says, "If you must make an interpretation, make sure it's an incorrect one. Pluck the wrong string, hit the wrong piano key." If your interpretation is correct, the patient has no work to do. Patients are cured by incorrect interpretations because the patient must correct them. This goes back to the notion of frustration and irritation being a natural part of learning, which requires the learner to exercise some aggression in sticking with the process. Here I'll provide two of my favorite definitions of aggression. This first one I heard from a group therapist named Jeannie Bunker, who's on the faculty at the Center for Group Studies. She says that aggression is the energy it takes to change one's environment. Even standing up and walking across the room for a glass of water can be seen as aggression. The other definition is in this Lucy Holmes article. Any act that reduces tension. So aggression is not always, or even often, destructive. We could certainly argue that sexual intercourse is a tension-reducing act, and in many cases it's the opposite of destructive. None of us would be here if two people hadn't had sex. We're all creations born of aggression. With this idea of tension in mind, it's easy to see that there's a lot of tension involved when we expect someone, like our therapist, to be smart and to know exactly how to help us, to know what we should do, and then come to find out that person doesn't have such knowledge and isn't always saying intelligent things. Indeed, much of the time that person doesn't say anything. And I know that when I'm silent as a therapist, either with individuals or when running groups, it's usually, or at least sometimes, because I don't know what to say. Lucy Holmes said it was freeing to realize that she didn't need to know anything or be right about anything. Quote, I could sit in bewildered silence for at least the first few years of treatment with my patients, with nothing more to do than feel the feelings in the room and try to temper my stupidity with understanding. One of my group members recently asked me why I hadn't said or done more in a previous session in which there had been a lot of conflict between two other group members. This question was painful to receive, as it touched on the regret I'd already been feeling about a lack of effective action on my part, but I took some comfort in knowing I'd done my best with what was available to me in the moment. And sometimes very little is available. Emotions are powerful. I'd argue they're one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And in group, many of those emotions are induced, which basically means we're feeling what other members are feeling or what they subconsciously need us to feel, which can be, to borrow Holmes's word, bewildering. In a sense, we become stupid. But the key isn't to become less stupid in those moments. It's to recognize that we've become stupid and to thereby give ourselves more access to other avenues forward, avenues that don't require us to be smart. If we can notice that we're feeling bewildered in a group, we can name it and maybe bridge at the same time. Is anyone else feeling bewildered right now? Chances are at least one person will be having a similar experience, and then we're talking about it, exploring it together. My response to that group member who asked why I hadn't done or said more was basically, of course after exploring everyone's fantasies around why I'd been so inept, I don't always know what to do. And my only should've around that response is that I should've followed it up with, what's it like to have a group leader who doesn't always know what to do? In his 2012 article, The Leader's Use of Self, Elliot Zeisel, of the group YouTube series fame, writes, to have confidence in my skills, I had to develop more freedom and expertise, and as the formula goes, I had to go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. As a young therapist, I became aware of how much there is to know and how much I did not know. I spent several painful years in this condition and slowly acquired skills that eventually allowed me to move to conscious competence. After many more years of practice, I moved toward unconscious competence. Through trial and error, I knew which interventions worked and why and could deliver them without worrying about my competence. Note that Zeisel says he spent several painful years in that condition, and that he calls it a condition is also humorous to me. You could also maybe call it a dark night of the soul, one of those experiences, and some can last a long, long time, several painful years, that challenges you to your core and is ultimately helping you become more of yourself. This lecture is called Creating the Self, and it's my primary motivation as a group leader, in that I want to help my group members create their selves, and I'm also creating myself in the process. In fact, I might benefit more in this way from running groups than my members do from participating in them. And of course, my group members want to be smart too. But the last thing I want from them is for them to say wise, important things. Or to be more clear, I don't want them to try to say such things. When they do that, they're less inclined to talk in the first place because they rarely think that what they could say is important enough or worth it or smart enough, etc. And if they do say something because they think it's smart, it's usually boring or it doesn't elicit much feeling from the group. It doesn't help people feel more connected to that person. All I want my group members to say is how they're feeling in the room toward each other. That's number one. I also welcome any associations they're making, sensations they're experiencing, and impulses they're noticing. Even the feelings wheel is too smart for its own good. Usually it's best to keep it as simple as possible when it comes to naming feelings. Mad, sad, glad, scared is a pretty good place to start. And when that's too many choices, I'll ask if it's yuck or yum, or if they like it or don't like it. In this way, a group invites us, to quote Jesus Christ, to become like little children. That's how we enter the kingdom of heaven. And I do believe that group can provide such an entryway. But that might be an example of how I'm a little crazy. So I'll hold on to that thought until the next part of the lecture. Dr. Mehta reassured us, Holmes writes, that being crazy ourselves gives us a unique understanding of and empathy for our patients. Quote, when the analyst can be worse than the patient can get better. The important thing is to be able to contain all the primitive thoughts and impulses induced in the analytic hour. She advised us to feel all our crazy feelings, to ask 3 to 5 object-oriented questions in the 50-minute session, and otherwise to keep quiet and stay in our chair no matter what we were feeling. McDougall, 1978, agrees with Dr. Meadow that too well adapted to life people do not make good analysts. We are little apt to understand psychic ills in our patients if we cannot recognize symptoms and psychic suffering within ourselves. Being normal keeps the analyst out of contact with her imaginative life. I've wondered about this a lot over the years, and I've sometimes felt like my good enough childhood and generally secure attachment system has put me at a deficit as a therapist. The worst of my childhood traumas was my parents getting divorced when I was 4. I developed a serious eating and exercise disorder when I was 12, but thanks to my good enough parents intervening and paying for professional help, I was well upon my path to recovery by 14. I've sometimes felt a twisted sort of envy for fellow therapists who've experienced more significant traumas, both as children and as adults, because it means they can relate to their clients more and therefore understand them better, which means their clients can have the very therapeutic experience of feeling understood. Similarly, I have felt less equipped to do my job because I don't have a clinical diagnosis of any kind. I am not bipolar or autistic, and I don't have ADHD, at least not more than anyone else in possession of a smartphone, nor do I identify as neurodivergent in any way, and I'm also not queer. I'm a cisgender, heteronormative white woman who's mostly well-adjusted to our totally insane society. That last part, though, does give me pause. J. Krishnamurti famously said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Here's where we could really get into the weeds of what it means to be sane or insane. I'm regularly struck by the insanity of cars and other automobiles. Just the sheer number of them that are always on the road is completely nuts. Traffic jams can send me into some of my darkest existential crises, as can navigating airports and big box stores. Our collective "because we can, we will" attitude is nothing short of psychotic, and most of us have lifestyles that either benefit from or completely depend upon maintaining this psychosis. Carl Jung once said, or so legend has it, "Show me a sane man, and I will cure him for you." I recently heard for the first time in a few years the Angel Olsen song "Always Half Strange," in which she sings, "When you live in the dark, you start to believe that everyone is asleep in the same way that you are, half life and half dream and half crazy to believe in anything at all." I believe in group with the fervor of a zealot. Since starting my first group in July of 2024, I've pretty much added another group to my schedule every 6 months, which doesn't include my monthly Time and Other Thieves group, which is a book club meets process group that meets on the last Wednesday of every month. And it doesn't include either of the 6-week student groups I ran or the free 3-part group I recently co-led. What's more, I'm a member of a weekly process group, mostly so I can get better at leading my own, and of a consultation group for group leaders that meets 3 times a week. And along with Chris Byrne, I started the Asheville Group Psychotherapy Society and host monthly meetings for therapists who are interested in group. So it's no secret that I'm obsessed. Is this obsession healthy or sane? It feels that way to me most of the time, but am I the most reliable judge? Is my near constant desire to be in the context of a process group, a context I like to call the you world, to borrow a phrase from Martin Buber, a way of avoiding the more mundane it world? Am I addicted to the aliveness that process groups offer, or at least to the possibility of that aliveness? And is my tolerance increasing in such a way that I'll never be truly satisfied? I could also argue that running process groups is a crazy thing to do even without being obsessed. I've had the experience multiple times of telling people about the kinds of groups I run and their response being, "That sounds terrible." Indeed, it can be terrible. As I said before, I think that human emotion is one of the most powerful forces in the universe, and I'm setting myself up multiple times a week to not only witness those emotions in others, but to feel them within myself and to confront them in ways I normally wouldn't. One of my beloved teachers encourages group leaders and members alike to move toward the fire. Whatever feels scary is the thing we should do, because a primary objective of group is to cultivate courage, which you can't do without taking risks. Compared to how the average person works, or more likely not, with emotions, there is madness to this job of mine. But I could just as easily argue that the world of the process group is far saner than the everyday it world of rarely to never saying what we actually think and feel, of constantly editing ourselves so others won't think or feel a certain way. That's crazy, if you think about it. Our efforts to prevent people from having a certain emotional experience. It's also quite presumptuous and condescending. Why should we deprive others of experiencing their full emotional range and learning from it? Aside from the craziness of choosing to work with emotions in this way, I'll also sometimes see it as crazy the way my colleagues and I talk about our groups. In the Masters of Group Therapy Club that meets 3 times a week, every now and then I'll have the experience of zooming out and assuming the position of the proverbial fly on the wall, imagining what that fly would think. In other professional meetings happening all over the world, people are hard at work trying to find a cure for cancer, to plan the launch of a new product, to improve infrastructure in their town, to discuss budgetary issues, etc., etc. But here we are, This group of 9 earnest and obsessed souls trying to help people get better at relational intimacy. We're brainstorming ways to help our group members give voice to their feelings. We're wondering about object-oriented versus ego-oriented questions, wondering things like, is this opposite day? Which mean that perhaps a group member is saying the opposite of what they feel. We're wondering if what they identify as a fear is actually, at least in part, a wish. Was that thank you really a fuck you? When they worry about hurting someone's feelings, does part of them actually want to hurt that person? And is hurting or being hurt always a bad thing? How could we have done a better job at drawing the aggression toward ourselves in that moment of conflict? How could we join? How could we bridge? And with what exact words? And how could we interpret this moment as if it were a dream? Most of the time, these explorations feel like the most normal and natural thing we could be doing. And other times I am struck by how bizarre they are compared to what the majority of people are putting their creative energy toward. And I'm endlessly grateful to be in this crazy minority. Halfway insane, to quote Angel Olsen again, and halfway home. Thank you for listening to this special lecture edition of Time and Other Thieves, although I guess all of the episodes could be considered lecture editions, except the interview ones. I'm Sarah B., and I look forward to the next time I'm able to sit down and record one of these for you. Meanwhile, feel free to reach out if you want to connect via email. sarahbsimpson@protonmail.com is my email address. That's Sarah with an H. And take good care.